Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf contains three basic sugyas. The first is, which candles are we allowed to use to search by? The Gemara will explain why we can't use sunlight and we can't use torchlight. The Gemara then goes back to the Mishnah and discusses places which do not have to be checked for chametz at all because you won't find chametz there. And then the Gemara, included in that, will speak about the concept of shluchei mitzvah and a nezaken. Somebody who's in the middle of doing a mitzvah will not be injured. Gemara has a couple of things to discuss about that. And the final discussion is the machlokas beisil and beishamai, which we saw mentioned in our Mishnah as to which parts of a wine cellar may you find chametz in, and therefore you have to search. So first of all, the Gemara is discussing checking by the light of a candle. The Gemara brings a brisa, which says that you should check by the light of a candle, not by sunlight and not by torchlight. The brisa brings the sources, the psukim which we've seen extensively in the Daf Zayin, which link the psukim of Yimotze to Chipos and Chipos to Ner, and therefore we know that you're supposed to use candlelight. Now the Gemara says, well, you said I shouldn't use sunlight. What do you mean I shouldn't use sunlight? Where are you talking about? If you mean in a yard doesn't need bedikas chametz at all because the birds eat all the chametz. If you mean in a gazebo or a chsadra, a pavilion, some kind of structure that's open to the sunlight, so the halacha is that you are allowed to check that to the light of the sunlight. We've seen that explicitly because there is enough light there to light up all the corners. So the Gemara says, I mean a skylight in a house where you have sunlight pouring into the room. So the Gemara says, hold on a second. If you mean in the area that's lit directly by the sunlight, right, absolutely under the light itself, then what's the problem? That should be just like a pavilion. You should be allowed to check there. So the Gemara says we're referring to the other parts of the room. They're lit by the sunlight, but not in direct sunlight, and therefore you can't check there. Now the Gemara says, what's wrong with a torch? A torch is a very effective way of searching. As a matter of fact, it's actually considered to be a candle itself. We have a pasuk that says, "V'noga kartia karnaim yado lo v'shem chevyon uzo." That says that tzaddikim are before the Shechina like a torch like a candle before a torch. So we see that a candle is just like a torch itself. How could there be a problem? So the Gemara gives four reasons why, even though a candle is just like a torch, there are differences and therefore it's not effective. Number one, although we see that you can use a torch for Havdalah, we still say that you won't be able to search with it because you'll be unable to bring it into the corners. The light is too big, the flame is too big, you won't be able to bring it into the corners, and therefore you won't be able to search effectively. Next answer, the Gemara says, is that a torch actually throws its light backwards, and therefore you won't be able to see past it. I guess the glare blinds you, and you don't see, it's not lit up the area beyond the torch. You want the candle which will not blind you, and you'll cast light forward. Next answer, the Gemara says, is that you're too concerned about safety when you're holding a torch, and therefore you won't be able to actually search effectively. And the Gemara's final answer is that the flame of a torch flickers, and therefore you can't see clearly, while the flame of a candle is steady and it's more usable for searching. Okay, now the Gemara refers back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah had said that you do not have to check in any place, kol makom, any place where you usually don't bring chametz. The Gemara says, what are you including by the phrase kol, the extra word kol, any place? You're teaching me some halachos here. The Gemara says, I'm including a number of things. I'm including the halacha that you do not have to check in holes in the wall that are very high or very low. You don't have to check a roof that's sloped because you can't use it for storage. You don't have to check the roof of a shed. You don't have to check a barn. The animals will eat it. You don't have to check a chicken coop, because the chickens will eat any chametz that's there. You don't have to check a storage room for straw, for wine, or for oil. All these places you wouldn't bring chametz into, and these are a number of places where you do not have to do actual b'dika itself. Now the Gemara has two contradictions here. Before that, we have a quote of Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, who says if you have a bed which divides the house into parts, meaning the bed is used as a partition, but there's actually storage space under the bed, and there's a gap under the bed itself. So Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says you do have to do b'dika there. So now the Gemara has contradictions to two of these halachos. Number one, we have a brisa which says that a hole in the wall does have to be checked. If it's a very wide wall and it's between two separate apartments, so each person has to check as far as he can reach. If there's still space in between further than that, then you don't have to check that. You don't have to worry about that. And it also says that a bed that has space under it, you do not have to check under the bed. So it's contradictory, these two halachas. How do you explain them? The Gemara says the difference is very simple. If it's at a height that it's usable, it's functional, then you do have to check it. So a hole in the wall that's at a height in which you could use it for storage, you have to check. If it's too high or too low, as our Mishnah said clearly, then you don't have to check. As far as the bed, if it's a very high bed, so the space under it is not functional, then you don't have to check it. If it's low, or if it's filled up and the space under it is functional, then you do have to check it itself. The Gemara now has some more contradictions as far as wine storage cellars. We have one brisa which we have seen that says you do have to check in the wine storage cellar. There's another one that says you don't have to check. Oil, though, it says everybody agrees you don't have to check. The Gemara says so you have a contradiction, wine cellars to wine cellars. The Gemara says the answer is one is referring to a wine cellar which you may actually take wine from in the middle of the meal and then you could bring bread down there with you, and the other one you don't take from the middle of the meal. So the Gemara says, well then why is oil you do not have to check at all? If it's a place you could, if we're referring to a wine cellar that you could go to in the middle of the meal, an oil cellar you could also go to in the middle of the meal. It says no, oil you don't need in the middle of the meal. You know at the beginning of the meal how much oil you need. People have a set fixed amount of oil that they use, and therefore you don't all of a sudden run out of oil in the middle of a meal. Wine, you don't really know how much everyone will drink. You could not prepare in advance enough, and you need to go get more. Gemara says a fish pool where you keep fish, you do not have to do bidika. The Gemara has a contradiction. We have another one that says you do. The Gemara says one is referring to a large one where you know you have enough and you set out enough in the beginning of the meal. If it's a small one, you may have to go back there in the middle of the meal. You won't have enough. More halachas. The Gemara says the storage space for salt and the storage space for wax. All these places do need bidika because you may go there in the middle of the meal. Where you keep your wood and where you keep the dates, you also have to check. The Gemara brings as well. Okay, that concludes the discussion of place you have to check. Now we go to the issue of sticking your hand into a wall in order to check for chametz may have been stored in the hole in the wall. Those walls were very thick and the holes were very deep. So the Gemara says, we have a brisa that says that you do not have to stick your hand into the wall to check because it is a sakana. There's a danger if you stick your hand into the wall. So Gemara says, what's the danger? If you read about scorpions in, so then how did you use it? How could you possibly have used it storing things in there in the first place? You may get bit by a scorpion. And if there's no scorpion, so then what's the danger? So the Gemara says, we're referring to where the house collapsed, the wall collapsed, now it's a pile of rubble. And you stored it, there was no issue of scorpions. But once you stopped, once it collapsed, scorpions like heaps of junk, and you may have a scorpion there. So the Gemara says, why do I have to check it at all if it collapsed? We have halacha that a building that fell on chametz is considered to be the chametz is considered to be destroyed. You don't have to look for it at all. Gemara says there's two levels to that. It depends how deep the chametz is. If it is close enough to the surface that a dog could smell it and dig after it, that's not destroyed because it may become uncovered on Pesach itself. Rashi says that that's 3 tvachim of the surface. That's where we say that you do have to check for it, but because of sakana, you wouldn't have to. On the other hand, if it's deep enough that a dog wouldn't be able to find it, it won't become exposed, it's considered destroyed, and then you won't have to check after it at all. Now the Gemara says, well, why should there be a problem of sakana? You're doing a mitzvah. We have a rule, shluchim mitzvah, and in the zaken, somebody who's doing a mitzvah will not be harmed by the performance of the mitzvah. The Gemara says, no, well, the issue is you may also be looking for a needle, and if you're looking for a needle, then it's not completely mitzvah, and therefore it doesn't count as a mitzvah, and it won't protect you. Gemara says that's not true. If you have another intent while you're doing a mitzvah, it doesn't take away from the mitzvah. As we see, somebody gives tzedakah and he says, I'm doing this that my son should live, or I'm doing this that I should get olam haba. Even though he has personal interest involved, it's still, he's called for that action a tzaddik gomer. He did a mitzvah completely, nothing wrong with that. Gemara says no, so the concern is that he may look for his needle after he's already finished the bidika. The bidika takes a few seconds, and then he may still be searching for his needle. At that point, he's not doing mitzvah anymore, and a scorpion could come take a bite out of him. The Gemara now offers a second explanation as to what the danger might be involved in sticking your hand into a hole in the wall to check for chametz. The Gemara says you may have a non-Jewish neighbor on the other side, and he becomes suspicious while you're sticking your hand into the wall. He may think you're performing some kind of witchcraft and come over and attack you. The Gemara says, well, then how do you use the wall in the first place that you need to check for chametz? The Gemara says it's different. You used it during the day without a candle. Now it's nighttime, and you're sticking your hand in the wall with a candle in your hand. It looks far more suspicious, and then he may come to suspect you of witchcraft. Now the Gemara says, but the same question we had before, what about shluchim mitzvah? What about the fact that you're involved in performance of a mitzvah and nothing bad should happen to you? The Gemara says here it's different. When you're starting up with a guy, there is shchiach hazeka. It's common that something bad will happen, and shluchim mitzvah only protects you when it's from uncommon situations, not from common situations like we see when Shmuel was sent to go anoint David as king. He said, if Shaul finds out, he's going to kill me, and that is because it's Shliach Hazeka, it's a common thing that may happen. Therefore, he was afraid that may happen, even though he was following Hashem's command. Now, on the topic, the Gemara says that what about students who are attending yeshiva, but the dorm is somewhat distant from the yeshiva? They live out in a village. Are they allowed to travel to yeshiva early in the morning or late at night when it's still dark outside? There are mazikim on the road. We know this was common in the days of Chazal. There were all kinds of demons and spirits which could attack people. Do they have to be concerned about that? Generally, you shouldn't travel at night, but if they're on the way to yeshiva, does that protect them? First, this question was asked to Rav, and Rav said, on my responsibility, they can travel, nothing's going to happen to them. Rav said, well, they're allowed to go back to the dorm. So on that, he said, I don't know. I'm not taking responsibility for that. But the Gemara quotes a brayso of Isi ben Yehuda, who says that this chus of mitzvah does protect you on the way back from the mitzvah, not only on the way to the mitzvah, but even on the way back. And his source is from the pasuk which says that Klal Yisrael shouldn't be afraid to go be ola regel, to go to Yerushalayim in order to appear there, as the mitzvah is on the 3 Yomim Tovim, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. The pasuk says, "V'lo yachmedish es artzecha," nobody's going to desire your land, and he says that means that your cow will be able to graze peacefully, and no animal will attack it. Your chicken will be able to poke away in the garbage, and no weasel will attack it. I don't have to worry about any of these things. Now, he says the Kal V'chomer. Animals do not have what's called mazel. They don't have any special protection, any special watching from Shemayim. Yet nothing is going to happen to them. So people who are on the way to doing a mitzvah, certainly they'll be protected and nothing's going to happen to them. And now he adds, you even will be protected on the way back, like it says in the pasuk about Aliyah Regel, Fanisa B'Bayker V'Alachta Lo'Alach, in the morning you go home. So you see that the same thing applies to the way back. The Gemara says, if that's the case, if you're telling me that I'll be okay on the way back, why do you need to tell me that I'll be okay on the way there? The Gemara says, well, that's a special halacha. We really need the pasuk for something else. That, like Rav Ami said, you only have a mitzvah to go be ola regel if you own land. If somebody doesn't own any land, doesn't have to do anything. He has no mitzvah of being ola regel, and that's why the pasuk of leyachmod is just artzecha. Nobody will desire your land. Comes to exclude people who don't own land. Now the Gemara, on a related note, brings that there was no peros genosar, no especially delicious fruits in Yerushalayim, so the people who are going to be ola regel shouldn't be going in order to partake of the fruits, and then it would be for their own purposes and not for the mitzvah. And for the same reason, there are no hot springs in Yerushalayim like there are in Tveria, so the people shouldn't be going to Yerushalayim to use the hot springs, and not specifically for the purpose of the mitzvah. Okay, that concludes the Gemara's discussion on the subject here. The Gemara now turns its attention to the Machokas Beis Hillel Beis Shammai, which we saw in the Mishnah, as to which parts of a wine cellar you need to check. Now let's imagine the wine cellar, it was filled with barrels of wine, layered in rows and in stacks. So you have the entire cellar filled up to the ceiling. So you have a 3-dimensional cube of wine barrels that are stacked up. Now we had seen in the Mishnah, Beis Shammai says that you just have to do the 2 forward-facing faces, the 2 faces of the wine, and that Beis Hillel says you have to just do 2 rows. Now the Gemara is a machlokes Amoraim in each of these Tanaim what they hold. What do Beis Shammai say? Beis Shammai said 2 facing rows. So what are these 2 facing rows? So Rabbi Yehuda says these are 2 parallel rows that are vertical, filling up the entire width of the cellar from wall to wall, but vertical from the floor to the ceiling, one behind the other. So, meaning to say, you walk into the wine cellar, there's an entire face of wine barrels facing you, stretching left to right and up and down. You have to check that entire face, plus the layer behind it. That is Rabbi Yehuda's understanding. Rabbi Yochanan says, no, you have to check the layer in front of you and the layer at the top of the wine cellar, all the way to the back, which makes like an L shape, or what he calls the shape of the Greek letter gamma. Now, that's a machlokes in Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel had said you have to check 2 outer rows. What does this mean? So the Gemara has a very similar machlokes within Beis Hillel's opinion. The Gemara says, Rav says you have to check the upper corner. That means the forward, closest to the door, and highest row. This is not an entire face. This is just a corner. It's the edge of the cube, the upper edge of the cube. And you have to check the row directly below the edge of the cube. Shmuel says you have to check the edge of the cube and the row directly behind it. Also on the top level, on the upper surface, but behind it. Now, the basis for this machlokes is the language that's used. He said that you need to check 2 upper outer rows. Which did he mean specifically? Did he mean specifically upper rows, but not necessarily the outer rows? So you would check the upper outer and the one behind it, but at least it's also upper. Or did he mean to say it has to be specifically outer rows, but not necessarily upper? So you should check the upper outer and the one below it, which is not exactly so much upper, but at least it's all outer. That is a machlokes in the language. Which word is non-specific? That's machlokes Rav and Shmuel. That concludes the daf, and daf test begins with the next one.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.